Welcome. We live in a world that's just awash in information. It's everywhere.
Hmm.
And when you're tackling something complex, something really structured, like a governance framework, COBIT, for instance,
Mm.
it's easy to feel completely overwhelmed.
Absolutely. You've got all these principles, objectives, components. It's a lot.
Right. 52 objectives, the goals cascade, the components. But the real question is, how do you take all that guidance, all that detail, and actually shape it into something that fits your organization, like a perfectly tailored suit? How do you cut through it all and find what's really essential for you?
That really is the core challenge, isn't it? Moving from the comprehensive, what good governance looks like according to COBIT, to the
Yeah.
practical, how do I apply this here?
Exactly. And that's where the COBIT design guide, particularly its appendices, really comes into play. They offer that systematic path.
They do. They're the bridge, the translation layer, taking your unique context and mapping it onto the framework.
And that's precisely our mission in this deep dive. We're not just summarizing, we're going on a guided tour, specifically through those critical appendices in the COBIT 2019 Design Guide.
Think of them as maybe the mapping keys, or the quantitative backbone that connects your situation to the framework's priorities. Our source material includes excerpts right from the guide showing the design process and these crucial appendices.
Yeah, and our goal here, specifically for you, the listener, using the material you've provided, is to unpack exactly how these concrete characteristics, things like your strategy, your risks, your current issues, compliance needs, even how you source IT, how they directly influence which of those 40 COBIT governance and management objectives you should prioritize.
And we'll do that by really digging into the mapping tables in those appendices.
Consider us your guides. We're here to walk you through these mappings, make them clear, make them, well, actionable. We want to shed light on the logic behind these tables, what the numbers actually mean for tailoring governance.
Okay, so let's start unpacking this. The design guide introduces this idea of design factors. Remember those?
The characteristics of the enterprise or its environment that shape the governance system design. Like in Figure 2.4, it lists 11 of them.
Right. Things like strategy, goals, risk profile, current I&T issues, the threat landscape.
Compliance needs, role of IT, implementation methods, tech adoption strategy, size, sourcing model. Yeah, the whole list.
So the earlier parts of the guide explain what these are and why they matter. But the appendices, that's where, for many key factors, the impact gets quantified. It becomes numerical, actionable.
Where the theory meets the road, so to speak.
Exactly. And to really use these appendices effectively, you first need to understand the scale they use. The main mapping tables use a numerical scale from 0 to 4. This is mentioned in the Toolkit section, Chapter 6, and the Intro to Appendix A.
Okay, 0 to 4. Let's break that down. What does 0 mean?
0 means basically no relevance, no influence. If a specific strategy, say, maps with a 0 to an objective, it means that strategy doesn't make that objective any more or less important, according to the expert panel who built these.
Got it. No connection.
And 4 is the opposite. Maximum relevance, maximum influence. If you see a 4, it means this specific characteristic, maybe a particular strategy or a high priority risk, makes that objective highly critical.
A strong signal. Pay close attention here if this applies to you.
Precisely. And values 1, 2, and 3 just represent those increasing degrees of relevance in between. Now, it's important, as the source notes, that these values are typically averages from an expert panel.
Right, so they provide directional guidance. That phrase stood out.
It's key. They're a strong evidence-based starting point, but not absolute law. The guide encourages enterprises to review and potentially tweak these mappings based on their own context, industry specifics, their own experience. That's part of step 4, refining with human judgment.
So structure, but not rigidity. Use the numbers, but think critically.
Exactly. And these numbers aren't just academic. They drive the toolkit calculations mentioned in Chapter 6. When you identify your situation, your strategy, your top risks, your issues, fishes, the toolkit uses these appendix mappings. It essentially multiplies the importance you assign to a factor value by the mapping value from the appendix.
Ah, okay. So it does the math to weight the objectives.
Yes. It aggregates these calculations across all the factors you've assessed to generate a weighted score, an importance level, for each of the 40 governance and management objectives.
So the appendices are like the rule book or the lookup tables the toolkit uses to translate your enterprise description into a ranked list of COBIT objectives.
That's a great way to put it. They objectify that link between context and framework. So let's dive into the specific appendices your source material highlights, following the design process flow. The first few contribute to step 2, Defining the initial scope.
Okay, first up is Appendix A, Design Factor 1, Enterprise Strategy.
Right. Appendix A, that's figure 8.1 in the source, maps those four main strategy archetypes from figure 2.5, growth acquisition, innovation differentiation, cost leadership, and client service stability against all 40 GM objectives using that 0-4 scale.
So if my company's primary strategy is, say, growth acquisition, Appendix A tells me which COBIT objectives are most critical for supporting that specific direction from an I&T standpoint.
Precisely. Let's look at some examples from the table values in the source. For growth acquisition, you see high values 3.5, even 4.0 for objectives like APO02, Managed Strategy, APO03, Managed Enterprise Architecture,
APO5, Managed Portfolio, BAI-01, Managed Programs, BAI-05, Managed Organizational Change, and BAI-11, Managed Projects.
Exactly. And think about why. You're growing, buying companies, you need INT aligned, APO02. You're integrating systems, so architecture is key, APO03. You're managing a portfolio of new initiatives, APO5, running complex integration programs, BAI-01, and projects, BAI-11, and managing the huge organizational change involved, BAI-05.
Yeah, if you neglect those areas during rapid growth or acquisition, you're asking for trouble. Integration fails, costs spiral, synergies vanish. The strategy itself is undermined. The mapping value reflects that risk.
That's a perfect way to think about it. The number reflects the consequence. Okay, what about innovation differentiation?
Appendix A gives high marks, often 4.0, to APO4, Managed Innovation, APO5, Managed Portfolio for the Innovation Pipeline, and BAI-08, Managed Knowledge.
Again, the logic fits. For innovation, you need processes to manage innovation itself, APO44. Prioritize those innovation investments, APO5, and crucially, share knowledge and ideas effectively, BAI-08.
Without focus here, your innovation could be chaotic, underfunded, or just reinventing the wheel, missed opportunities.
Exactly. Now, cost leadership. The source points to high values, 4.0 for EDM04, Ensured Resource Optimization, and APO06, Managed Budget and Costs.
That one seems pretty direct. If cost is king, optimizing INT resources, EDM04, and tightly managing budgets, APO06, are non-negotiable. Failure here directly hits your competitive advantage.
Absolutely. And finally, client service stability.
Here we see high values, 3.5 or 4.0, for objectives focused on delivery and operations. EDMs02, benefits delivery, APO08, relationships, APO09, service agreements, APO11, quality, BAI-04, availability capacity, DSS02, incidents requests, and DSS004, continuity.
It paints a picture of operational excellence for the customer. Delivering benefits, EDMs02, managing relationships, APO8, hitting SLAs, APO9, ensuring quality, APO11, keeping things running, BAI-04, fixing issues fast, DSS02, and surviving disruptions, DSS04.
If you promise great service and stability, but INT governance ignores these, you'll have outages, slow support, unhappy customers, damaging the very strategy you're pursuing.
So fundamentally, Appendix A provides that direct quantitative link between business direction and INT governance focus. It's a critical first step in determining that initial scope, like we see in the Chapter 7 examples. Strategy prioritization in Figures 7.1, 7.5 directly shapes the importance maps in 7.6, 7.34.
Okay, so Appendix A connects strategy to objectives needed to enable it. What's next for the initial scope?
Next is Design Factor 2, Enterprise Goals. This uses the Goals Cascade, which involves Appendices B and C. It's that two-step mapping process we talked about, described in Section 4.3.3.
Translating high-level business goals down to INT priorities. But why the two steps again? Why not map enterprise goals straight to the COBIT objectives?
It's about that necessary translation layer. Enterprise goals, like those in Figure 2.6, manage business risk, optimized internal processes, they're very broad business outcomes. Alignment goals bridge the gap. They rephrase these in INT terms like managed INT-related risk, realized benefits from INT investments. This ensures the final mapping to the COBIT objectives is truly relevant to how INT contributes. It keeps that clear line of sight.
Okay, that makes sense. It filters the business goal through an INT lens first. So tell us about Appendix B, the first step.
Appendix B, Figure 8.2 in the source, maps the 13 generic enterprise goals, EGs, to the 13 generic alignment goals, AGs. But instead of 0-4, it uses P for a primary relationship, strong relevance, and S for secondary, meaning moderate relevance.
So you pick your top EGs, look them up in Appendix B, and find the primary and secondary AGs that INT needs to focus on.
Exactly. Let's say your enterprise prioritizes EG02, managed business risk. Appendix B shows a primary link to AG02, managed INT-related risk, and secondary links to AG01, alignment of INT with strategy, and AG06, delivery of INT services.
Okay, so managing overall business risk heavily relies on INT managing its specific risks.
That's the primary connection it highlights. Then you take those prioritized alignment goals like AG02 and move to Appendix C.
Appendix C, Figure 8.3. The second step, mapping alignment goals to the actual governance and management objectives. Still using P&S.
Yes, same P&S indicators. So continuing our example with AG02, managed INT-related risk. Appendix C shows it maps primarily to two objectives, EDMs 03, Insured Risk Optimization, a governance one, and APO 12, Managed Risk Management one.
It has secondary mappings too.
It does. S mappings to APO 01, Managed INT Management Framework, APO 13, Managed Security, BAI 05, Managed Organizational Change, and MEA 02, Managed System of Internal Control.
Wow, okay. So the cascade doesn't just point to one thing. For managing INT risk, it says you need governance oversight, EDM 03, operational risk management, APO 12, but also a solid framework, APO R1, good security, APO 13, awareness of change impacts, BAI or 5, and internal controls monitoring, MEA 02. It shows the different facets involved.
Precisely. It connects the dots from that high-level business goal, EG02, through the INT goal, AG02, right down to the specific COBIT activities needed. The design process uses this prioritize a few key EGs, as recommended in Section 4.3.3 and shown in Step 1.2 examples, Figure 7.2.
Otherwise, you get noise, not signal.
Exactly. Then use Appendix B for alignment goals and Appendix C for the GM objectives, Step 2.2 leading to importance maps like Figure 7.8. The source calls the cascade purely mechanical, but it's incredibly powerful for translating outcomes to actions, a real cornerstone of Step 2.
Got it. Strategy, DF1, goals, DF2. What's the third factor and appendix for the initial scope?
That's design factor 3, risk profile, using Appendix D. Figure 8.4 provides this mapping. It links the 19 generic IT risk categories, things like IT investment decision-making, security vulnerabilities, system unavailability from Figure 2.7 to the 40 GM objectives.
And the values here, 04 again, what do they represent?
Yes, 04. Here, the value shows how much a specific GM objective acts as an effective control for that particular type of IT risk.
Ah, okay. So it's not just identifying risks, it's using the appendix to see which APID objectives help you manage or mitigate those risks.
Exactly. The process is identify your significant IT risks, the ones keeping you up at night, exceeding your risk appetite. That's Step 1.3, Figure 7.3 in the examples. Then, Appendix D translates those risks into priorities for the GM objectives that serve as controls. Step 2.3, Figure 7.9.
Can we look at an example?
Sure. Take risk category 11, logical impacts, hacking, malware, etc. If that's a big concern, Appendix D shows high values, 4.0 for APO 13, Managed Security, and DSS25, Managed Security Services.
Makes perfect sense. Worried about cyber attacks? Focus on managing security overall, APO 13, and the day-to-day security operations, DSS 05. Those are the controls.
Right. The mapping confirms the intuitive need with data. Another one. Risk category 1, IT investment decision-making. If you struggle with making good IT investments, Appendix D gives high values like 3.5 to APO 5 Managed Portfolio and BAI 01 Managed Programs.
Also logical, poor investments often stem from weak portfolio management, APO 05, how you choose projects, and poor program management, BAI 01, in executing them. Focusing there improves control.
So Appendix D is vital if risk management is a major driver for your governance efforts. It connects your specific worries to the COBIT controls needed, a key input for Step 2's initial scope.
Okay, and the fourth design factor for that initial scope?
Design factor 4, current INT-related issues, mapped in Appendix E. This links common problems like user frustration, significant incidents, high cost, project delivery issues from Figure 2.8 to the GM objectives. The 04 values here show how much improving an objective is likely to help resolve that specific issue.
This one feels very practical, very boots on the ground, less strategy, more what hurts right now and how does COBIT fix it?
That's exactly the focus. Identify the current pain points, Step 1.4, Figure 7.4, then use Appendix E to see which objectives offer the most direct solutions. Step 2.4, Figure 7. Level 1.
Let's do an example here too.
Okay, consider Issue C. Significant IT-related incidents, data loss, security breaches, etc. Appendix E shows high values for many DSS objectives, DSS 02, incidents requests, DSS 03, problems, DSS-04 continuity, DSS-05 security services. Also high for MEA objectives like MEA-01 performance monitoring and MEA-03 compliance monitoring.
Again, very intuitive. Plagued by incidents, improve how you handle them, DSS-02. Find root causes, DSS-03. Ensure continuity, DSS-04. Bolster security, DSS-05. And monitor things better, MEA-01, MEA-03. The appendix points you right to the operational fixes.
Exactly. Another one, Issue M, excessively high cost of IT. Appendix E maps as highly to APO-06, budget costs, and EDM-04, resource optimization, obviously, but also strongly to BAI-06, managed IT changes, BA-09, managed assets, and BAI-10, managed configuration.
Interesting. So high costs aren't just about the budget. It suggests inefficient change management, BA-ISO-6, poor asset tracking, BAI-09, or configuration issues, BAA-10, can drive up costs too. You need to look broader.
Precisely. It shows how underlying management practices contribute. So Appendix E helps you tackle those tangible day-to-day problems by highlighting the relevant COBIT objectives. Another key input for the initial scope in Step 2.
Okay, so Appendices A, B, C, D, and E combine their weightings based on strategy, goals, risk, and issues to create that initial scope. Section 4.3.6 and figures like 7.13 show that outcome. What happens next?
After Step 2 gives you that initial prioritized list, you move to Step 3, refining the scope. Section 4.4 covers this. Now, you consider the remaining design factors, the ones that didn't contribute directly to that initial scoring, but still influence the final design.
So Step 2 sets the baseline priorities, and Step 3 tweaks them based on other context.
That's the idea. The appendices for these other factors provide more mappings or guidance. They might adjust priorities, influence the target capability levels you aim for, or suggest specific ways to tailor components.
Okay, which appendices for Step 3 refinement are in our source material? Appendix G?
Yes, Appendix G, Figure 8.7. This maps Design Factor 6. Compliance requirements. It looks at whether your compliance needs are high, normal, or low, like in Figure 2.0, and uses the 0-4 scale to show which GM objectives become more important as compliance needs increase.
And what does it show for high compliance?
For enterprises facing heavy regulation, think finance, healthcare. Appendix G boosts the values for objectives like EDM-01, governance framework, EDM-03, risk optimization, APO-12, managed risk, APO-14, managed data, MEA-03, managed compliance, and MEO-4, managed assurance. Often values at 3.0, 3.5, 4.0.
That makes total sense. High regulation means you need a strong governance framework. EDM-01, intense focus on risk, EDM-03, APO-12, careful data management, APO-14, specific processes to manage compliance, MEA-03, and assurance to prove it, MEA-04.
It directly links that external legal landscape to your internal governance priorities. Example 1, with normal compliance, Figure 7.1c, showed minimal impacts from this factor, Figure 7.1, matching the lower values in the appendix. This mapping is applied in Step 3.2.
What about how IT services are sourced? Does that change priorities? DF8.
Absolutely. Design Factor 8, sourcing model for IT, mapped in Appendix I, Figure 8.9.
Yeah.
It takes models like outsourcing, cloud, insourced, hybrid, context in Figure 2.9, and maps them to the GM objectives, showing what becomes more important depending on how you get your IT.
So how does using outsourcing or cloud compare to doing it all in-house?
Appendix I shows significantly higher values, often 4.0 for APO-9, managed service agreements, and APO-10, managed vendors, when you use outsourcing or cloud. Also a high value, 3.0 for MEA-01, managed performance monitoring.
Right. It screams manage the external relationship. Contracts, APO-9, the vendors themselves, APO-10, and monitoring their performance, MEA-01, become critical when you rely on others. The risks are different.
Exactly. The complexity shifts. Now, interestingly, for insourcing, Appendix I generally shows lower values, often 1.0, across most objectives compared to the others.
Lower, so insourcing doesn't make things more important.
It suggests the baseline COBIT objectives apply, of course, but the act of insourcing itself doesn't necessarily elevate priorities in the same way that managing third-party risks and contracts does for outsourcing or cloud. Those external factors add specific governance burdens.
That's fascinating. It almost implies the core COBIT model is kind of baseline for insource, and the other mappings show the extra focus needed for external models.
That's a reasonable interpretation. The appendices highlight where different operating models require you to put more weight. This is used in Step 3.4, Figure 7.21, and you see its impact in the examples, like Example 2 being 100% cloud, Figure 7.4.
You mentioned other design factors and appendices for Step 3 that weren't detailed in our source excerpts.
That's right. The full guide has mappings for the threat landscape, DF5, Appendix F, role of IT, DF7, Appendix H, IT implementation methods like Agile versus Waterfall, DF9, Appendix J, and technology adoption strategy, DF10, Appendix K. The Chapter 7 examples, Figure 7.42, show these being used in Step 3 refinement, even if we didn't have those specific tables.
And what about enterprise size, D11? The source mentioned that one works a bit differently.
Yeah, enterprise size is considered in Step 3.7. But as the source notes, Section 6.4.7, especially for SMEs, it doesn't usually change the numerical priority scores of the 40 objectives via mappings like the others. Instead, it points towards using specific SME-focused guidance, maybe simplifying processes, using a subset of objectives, tailoring components differently. It affects the how of implementation, not so much the which objectives score highest in the main calculation.
Okay, so size influences the approach and scale, particularly for SMEs, more than the core objective rankings from the other factors.
Exactly. It's about tailoring the application, not the fundamental prioritization numbers.
So after applying all these factors, A, B, C, D, E for Step 2's initial scope, then G, I, and the others, plus size guidance for Step 3's refinement, where does that leave us?
You've reached the end of Step 3, the refined scope. As Section 4.4.8 describes and figures like 7.27 or 7.55 show, you now have this quantitatively derived, prioritized list of GM objectives tailored to your unique enterprise context.
And this refined list is the input for the final step.
Yes, it's the primary input for Step 4, Section 4.5, where you finalize the design. This involves reviewing the quantitative results, resolving any conflicts, maybe different factors pushed slightly different ways, and crucially, applying that human judgment. Making final tweaks based on culture, politics, things the numbers don't fully capture.
Which really brings us back to the key takeaway from this whole exploration of the appendices.
Absolutely. The key thing is, these appendices aren't just extra reading, they're the engine room. They provide the systematic, quantitative how-to for translating the idea of tailoring into practice. They are the bridge between describing your enterprise and getting a prioritized COBIT focus.
And for you, the listener, understanding these mappings is, well, it's empowering. It demystifies why certain things are critical in one situation but less so in another. It makes COBIT practical, relevant to your world, offering that data-driven starting point for prioritization.
It helps you move beyond just adopting the framework wholesale to actually designing a system that fits your specific needs and challenges.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the quantitative core of the Design Guide appendices, here's something to think about. We focused heavily on the numbers, the mappings, the toolkit calculations in steps 2 and 3. It sounds very objective, almost automated.
Provides that structure.
But the guide explicitly calls out step 4 for human judgment, conflict resolution, final adjustments based on context, like in the examples where they deliberately tweak calculated priorities.
Right. The numbers are input, not the final unchangeable output.
So the question is, given this reliance on quantitative analysis early on, just how crucial is that final art of interpretation in step 4? How vital is the human element in taking those calculated results and making the final adjustments based on judgment, organizational reality, maybe even intuition? Where does the structured process end, and where must the human touch take over to create a truly effective, real-world governance system?
A really fundamental question to ponder as you apply these tools.
Definitely something to think about. That's all the time we have for this particular deep dive. We hope walking through these COBIT Design Guide appendices helps you see how to use these powerful mapping tools.
Hopefully it clarifies how to tailor your own INT governance system effectively. Until next time.